My name is Evelyn, and I'm 38 years old. The day I lost my home was the day I stopped trusting anyone. My house wasn't just a structure of bricks and wood. It was my grandmother's legacy, a little white cottage on the edge of a quiet town in North Carolina. Every wall carried memories, from the faint scent of her rose-scented candles to the tiny carvings she'd etched into the porch rail when she was young. It wasn't big, it wasn't fancy, but it was mine, and that meant everything to me. After my divorce, that house became my anchor. It was where I rebuilt myself from the ashes, where I learned that independence could feel like peace. When I lost my job at the local publishing firm, that peace began to crack. Bills piled up. The mortgage was manageable, but the utilities and repairs kept eating into my savings. I'd been scraping by, hoping something would turn around soon. That's when my closest friend, Tessa, stepped in. Tessa and I had known each other for over 10 years. She'd been my confidant, my late-night wine companion, the one person who made me laugh when I thought I couldn't. When she offered to help me get back on track, I thought she meant emotional support or maybe helping me find new work. But instead, she introduced me to someone she called a financial consultant, a man named Derek. Derek was smooth-talking and confident, with a business-like charm that made you feel small but safe. He wore expensive suits, drove a silver Mercedes, and spoke with the kind of calm certainty that could make even the most skeptical person believe him. He claimed he specialized in helping homeowners refinance their properties, restructuring debt, as he put it. Tessa vouched for him completely. He helped my cousin save her place, she'd said. You just need to sign a few things to lower your interest rate. You'll thank me later. At the time, I was too desperate to question it. I remember sitting at my kitchen table, my grandmother's old lace tablecloth spread beneath the papers. Derek handed me. He explained every page quickly, confidently, like he'd done it 100 times before. I asked a few questions, but he brushed them off with reassuring smiles and phrases like, standard legal terminology. Tessa sat beside me the whole time, sipping coffee, nodding in agreement. I signed. A week later, Derek dropped by again to finalize a few details. He had me sign another set of documents, photocopies this time, with fewer pages. I barely glanced through them. I trusted my friend, and by extension, him. When they left that day, I remember standing on my porch, feeling oddly lighter. I thought I'd made a responsible adult decision, but the peace didn't last. A few weeks later, I got a letter in the mail. It was an eviction notice. Confused, I called the county clerk's office, thinking it was some kind of mistake. That's when they told me, flatly, that the property had been transferred to a company called Silverline Investments. I didn't even understand what that meant. I reread the letter again and again, my brain refusing to accept it. My name wasn't listed as the owner anymore. I'd apparently signed the property over completely. Panic took over. I called Tessa immediately, but she didn't answer. I texted her, begging her to explain, to tell me what was happening. Hours turned into days before she finally replied. Her message was short, cold. Evie, you knew the deal. Don't make this messy. I'm sorry it came to this. The words blurred on the screen. My chest tightened. I called her again and again until she finally picked up, sounding irritated. Evelyn, she said. You agreed to sell. Derek made it clear you signed. You can't take that back now. It's business. I remember my voice breaking when I said, Tessa, you were my friend. Her silence was worse than anything she could have said. Then she hung up. The next few days felt like a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. Strangers came to the house, realtors, inspectors, potential buyers. I sat in my car across the street, watching them walk through what used to be my home. The home my grandmother had died in, the home I'd painted myself, repaired with my own hands. Every time someone laughed or pointed at something inside, it felt like a knife twisting deeper. I went to the police, trembling, with my documents in hand. But they dismissed me almost immediately. It's a civil matter, they said. If you signed it, we can't do anything. My lawyer echoed the same sentiment. It's a valid transaction, he told me. Unless you can prove coercion or fraud. Fraud, The word hung in my mind like a dark cloud. I had no proof. Just a feeling. But that feeling burned hotter than grief. It was fury. I stared at the copies of my signature, realizing they didn't even look like mine. I had been tricked, used, betrayed. That night, I drove past my house one last time. The porch light was on. Tessa's car was parked in the driveway. My driveway. The sight of it shattered something inside me. The house I loved more than anything was no longer mine. I didn't cry when I read the notice, I froze. There are moments in life when your body reacts before your mind can process anything. That eviction notice had felt like a punch straight to the chest. But what came after the realization of who had done it was worse. Tessa wasn't just some acquaintance. She was the person who'd stood beside me through my divorce, who'd brought soup when I was sick, who knew the code to my front door. The thought that she'd orchestrated everything made my skin crawl. I spent that night sitting on the floor of the motel room I'd rented after being forced out, surrounded by boxes I hadn't even unpacked. The hum of the mini-fridge was the only sound. My hands shook as I scrolled through my old text messages with her, searching for any clue, any hint that could have warned me. Everything looked normal, friendly check-ins, memes, dinner plans. Then I saw the first message where she mentioned Derek. "You're lucky I know someone who actually helps people instead of taking from them." The irony made me laugh, that bitter, broken kind of laugh that sounds more like choking. I called Derek's number again and again. Disconnected. His office? Gone. His LinkedIn page? Deleted. It was as if he'd never existed. I tried Tessa's number next, straight to voicemail. When she finally picked up 2 days later, her voice was sharp and dismissive, not the soft, familiar tone I knew. "Evelyn, you need to stop this," she said. "You signed, there's nothing more to say." "Signed what?" I demanded. "You and Derek tricked me. You told me it was refinancing paperwork." She sighed. "You should have read it more carefully." That sentence stuck to my ribs like poison. I shouted at her, called her every name I could think of. But she hung up mid-sentence. I stared at my phone for what felt like hours, listening to the silence, my heart pounding in my ears. That was when it hit me. I'd lost my home, my savings, and my best friend in one calculated move. Days blurred together after that. I met with lawyers who told me variations of the same thing. Without proof of coercion, I didn't have a case. Every conversation ended with polite condolences and subtle accusations that I'd been careless. My anger turned inward. How could I have been so stupid? How did I not see it? I replayed every conversation with Tessa in my mind, searching for hidden meanings. There were signs: the way she'd insisted on being there during the signing, how she'd rushed me through certain pages, the times she'd called Derek trustworthy before I'd even asked. Still, part of me didn't want to believe it. I kept thinking maybe there'd been a misunderstanding, maybe she'd been manipulated by Derek too. But then one afternoon, I drove by the house, my house, and saw her standing on the porch with him. She was laughing. The sight of it was enough to rip the breath from my lungs. They were standing there like a couple, her hand on his arm, his smirk confident and easy. They looked like they owned the place. Maybe they did. I sat in my car, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. Every ounce of disbelief burned away, leaving only rage. I wanted to storm up there and scream at them, but I didn't. I stayed parked down the street, hidden behind a row of hedges, watching. A few minutes later, a real estate agent pulled up. I recognized her from a local agency I'd worked with years ago. She shook Derek's hand, and they walked the agent through the property, pointing out features like the freshly painted shutters I'd done myself. They were selling it. My home, my grandmother's home, was being listed as an investment opportunity. I watched until the sun went down. When they went back inside, I drove away, tears blurring my vision. I didn't stop driving until I reached a rest area 30 miles out of town. I sat there for hours, engine off, staring into the dark. I called the police again the next morning. The officer sounded sympathetic but firm. "Ma'am, I understand how you feel, but it's a civil issue. If you sign the deed, it's binding unless proven fraudulent." I hung up mid-sentence. The law wasn't on my side, not yet. That night, I pulled out the copies of the documents I'd managed to keep. I laid them out across the motel bed and looked closely at every line. Something about the signatures looked off. The strokes of the pen, the way my last name was written, it wasn't quite right. I compared it to my driver's license signature, and that's when I saw it. The loops were slightly different, the spacing uneven. My hands trembled. I might not have had proof yet, but I had something, a reason to fight back. For the next few days, I barely ate or slept. I started researching real estate fraud online, reading every article and watching every video I could find. I learned about forged documents, title scams, and property theft. It was terrifying how common it was, but knowing that others had fought back and won gave me the first flicker of hope I'd felt in weeks. Still, I was broke, alone, and technically homeless. I'd been scammed out of everything that mattered to me. I didn't have the money to hire investigators or the influence to get attention. But I had something they didn't. I had nothing left to lose. So, while Tessa and Derek celebrated their win, I started to plan. I didn't know how, or when, but I was going to make them pay. But they didn't know who they were dealing with. If they thought I'd disappear quietly, they were dead wrong. I didn't let myself fall apart again. After the eviction, the motel room smelled like stale coffee and cheap detergent, and loneliness was a constant, heavy thing. I slept in short bursts and used the hours between dawn and noon to dig. I pulled every paper, every email, every text that could possibly belong in a paper trail and spread it across the small table until the surface was a chaotic map of the last year. Receipts from hardware stores where I'd bought paint for the porch, invoices for the foundation repair my grandmother had advised me to do years ago, old utility bills in my name, anything with my address or signature went into the pile. I retraced my steps with Tessa through my phone. At first our messages were the same as always. Jokes about work, pictures of ridiculous thrift store finds. The kind of mundane intimacy that fools you into thinking someone is unremarkable and safe. Then I found the thread where she introduced Derek to me, where she sent a scanned PDF labeled Refi Docs. I opened it and felt my stomach drop. Pages were missing, headers replaced, clauses that would have protected me gone. I compared the file's metadata to my own saved documents and noticed something odd. The file had been edited on a laptop registered to an address 2 towns over. I copied the metadata into a note and kept reading. Using online property records at the county assessor's site, I typed in Silverline Investments and then Derek's name, but the company's registration came back under a woman's maiden name I recognized from Tessa's high school yearbook. I stared at the screen until the letters blurred. She'd changed her name when she married. She'd never used that maiden name in years. Why was it on the title transfer? I dug deeper into business filings and found a shell corporation with the exact same mailing address Derek had given me the first day he came to the house. The more I clicked, the mess unfolded like a badly scripted play. A late-night reverse image search turned up a photo of Derek and Tessa together on a beach in Mexico, arms around each other, smiling at the camera. The timestamp was weeks before the transfer. My hands went cold. I felt sick and strangely vindicated at once. They weren't partners in some vague financial plan, they were conspirators. I printed everything I could and began to catalog it, making notes in the margins like a detective in a TV show. Each small discovery steadied me. Each small discovery made my anger more precise. I started recording phone calls and taking screenshots of messages. I became obsessive about documentation, the dates of every visit, the make of the car they drove, the names of the contractors who'd shown up. I reached out carefully, under the pretense of curiosity, to a neighbor who'd always been friendly and asked if she'd noticed anything unusual around the house. She remembered seeing a folder left on my mailbox one afternoon and a man carrying boxes a week later. She thought it was an estate sale. I wrote it all down. I messaged a contact from a community forum who worked in title insurance, asking general questions about how transfers could be reversed. He replied with legalese and clued me into the importance of intent and forged signatures. That word, forgery, felt like a key I'd been missing. If my signature was falsified, if the notary had been complicit or negligent, then the whole thing could be challenged. I needed professional help, but I couldn't afford a private investigator. I had Lydia, though my friend from when I did odd paralegal work for the county clinic. She owed me favors. I owed her honesty. I told her everything in a few breathless messages, careful to frame it as questions so she wouldn't panic and tip anyone off. Lydia replied at 3 a.m. with practical steps. Submit a request for certified copies of the deed, file a fraud alert with the county recorder, and, if possible, get notarized statements from witnesses who saw me sign nothing of the sort. She warned me about the uphill battle and suggested I record any future interactions. Her tone was blunt and realistic, but she said she'd help me look over documents. I felt the tide turning just a little. I hacked together a plan to gather more direct evidence. I created an anonymous email and used it to contact one of Derek's listed business partners, posing as a potential investor interested in quick flips. The man wrote back, arrogant and careless, bragging about how fast properties moved through their network and dropping casual references to paperwork adjustments that made my skin crawl. I forwarded the exchange to Lydia, and she told me to keep him talking. Every casual boast they made became potential leverage. I spoke to a former client of Derek's, a woman who'd lost a rental property 2 years earlier and had quietly moved away. At first, she didn't want to get involved, frightened of retaliation, but when I explained I suspected forgery and showed her the Mexico photo, something in her shifted. She sent me copies of her own paperwork where the same odd notary stamp appeared. Patterns emerged like constellations. I cross-checked the stamps and dates and realized the same notary name showed up on multiple dubious transfers. I printed that too. That night, as I organized the pile of evidence on the motel bed, I felt a clarity I hadn't known since the eviction notice arrived. This was not going to be a plea, it was going to be a fight. I imagined the courtroom, the slow flip of pages, the hush when facts land like stones. I also imagined Tessa and Derek, smug and confident, blind to what was coming. I rehearsed questions in my head, the cold, precise ones that would make their lies wrinkle. I whispered promises into the darkness until the motel room felt less like exile and more like a war room where I was drafting my strategy. That was the moment my revenge plan truly began. Revenge doesn't come from rage, it comes from strategy. I taught myself patience the hard way. Anger was useful for fuel, but if I wanted them dismantled properly, I needed systems, not tantrums. I started by learning the language they used: escrow, title search, chain of custody, beneficiary assignments. I signed up for online real estate webinars and county record office workshops and sat through hours of lectures until the jargon felt natural in my mouth. I took furious notes on my phone during bathroom breaks at the motel and read them until the words stopped feeling foreign. The more I learned, the more holes I found in the story Derek and Tessa had stitched together. Knowledge turned my panic into plan. Next, I needed to see the world through their eyes, to find where they were careless and complacent. I created a fake persona, careful, bland, professional, an investor avatar with a clean email, a LinkedIn profile that looked legitimate, and a backstory thin enough not to invite too much scrutiny. Under that guise, I reached out to 2 people linked to Derek's network, asking about potential flips and quick-turn investments. Their responses were sloppy and cocky. They bragged about moving properties off-market, about little allowances they put in paperwork when sellers were motivated. Every casual boast was a thread I could pull. I used that persona to join private investor groups and forums where Derek's kind liked to posture. I asked dumb questions to bait arrogance. I let them underestimate me. They began sending me invites to off-record auctions and forwarded me sample contracts that used the same notary stamps and odd clauses that had shown up on my own forged deed. I screenshot every message and saved HTML pages. I built a digital dossier that looked at first glance like a novice investor's folder until anyone tried to examine the substance. Simultaneously, I reached out to other people I'd found in the tangles of title transfers. I messaged the woman from the rental property again, this time honest and direct, no pretense. When she hesitated, I told her everything I'd learned and how many others I suspected were involved. Fear is contagious, but so is courage. She finally agreed to speak with me and put me in touch with 2 more victims. Their stories overlapped like puzzle pieces, same notary, same fast-track transfers, handwritten initials that looked similar across documents. Pattern recognition was my friend. The evidence started to form a shape I could show others. While I gathered testimony, I also built deception of my own, not to harm innocents, but to catch liars in their lies. I fabricated a small paper trail that suggested I'd accepted ambiguous consultation fees from Derek, a few phony invoices, emails I never sent but saved as drafts, a bank screenshot with numbers blurred. It felt dirty writing lies, but my aim was surgical. When they denied involvement or claimed no contact, those fabricated breadcrumbs would force inconsistencies that could be cross-examined and exposed. I documented when, where, and how I created these items, so it was clear later they were part of a setup to catch them in their denials, not to create actual evidence against third parties. I cultivated 2 allies who would turn out to be crucial. Lydia helped me interpret what I found and advised me on how to preserve chain of custody for digital files so they could be admissible. Cole, a private investigator I could barely afford but found through an online forum, agreed to take my case at a reduced rate because he'd seen Derek's name before. Cole's network traced shell companies and obscure bank accounts and taught me what to look for in wiring receipts and incorporation dates. He dug into the company registrations and found a tiny administrative error, a single mismatched digit in an EIN filing that provided an unexpected lever. I also played a long game with Tessa's social media. While she posted images of new clothes, meals at trendy spots, and vague inspirational quotes, I kept my comments neutral and occasionally complimentary so I wouldn't trigger suspicion. Behind that facade, I archived everything: geotags, timestamps, photos that suggested travel dates overlapping with their suspicious filings, screenshots of throwaway boasts that later contradicted her formal statements. Social media is a modern diary for the careless. It became one of my best witnesses. One night, using the investor alias, I arranged a meeting with a mid-level associate in Derek's circle at a coffee shop downtown. I arrived with a small recorder and a calm smile. He was more talkative in person, flirting with the idea of creative closings and mentioning names that previously had only been initials in my files. He even referred to a friendly notary who liked to help when time was tight. I left the meeting with audio that would later be transcribed and compared to other statements. Each recorded syllable folded into the dossier like a nail in a coffin. Every move I made was measured to avoid tipping my hand. I never accused publicly. I never posted the worst of my findings on forums. Instead, I cultivated a small, verifiable spine of facts, timestamps, photos, witnesses, and transcriptions, and stored them in 3 places: an encrypted cloud, a USB I hid with an old neighbor who still loved me, and a physical folder in a P.O. box I rented under my alias. Strategy, not spectacle, was my tactic. I wanted them to keep acting as if nothing was wrong while the net closed slowly and relentlessly around them. The pieces were moving exactly where I wanted them. They were selling my house right under my nose. I found out about the auction the same way most desperate things find you, through a scrap of overheard conversation. A realtor I'd once done a favor for called a number I'd given him, and there it was, a private investor event 3 towns over, billed as an exclusive off-market opportunity. The invitation list was clipped. The venue, a hotel ballroom that smelled faintly of lemon and ambition. I didn't own a suit that fit right, but I had an alias, a practiced calm, and a willingness to look like someone who belonged in the room. I bought a simple black dress, had my hair pulled back, and rehearsed a bored investor air until it felt like breathing. Driving there, I felt ridiculous and deadly serious at the same time. I parked 2 blocks away and walked in as if I owned the confidence I was pretending to have. The ballroom glittered with small clusters of people, middle-aged men with fat business cards, women in sharp blazers who glanced at you like you might be competition. A projector at the front with glossy photos of properties cycling through. Then I saw it. My house. On the screen in full color. The same crooked rosebush. The same whitewashed porch. I'd scrubbed myself. The caption called it a high-yield foreclosure flip. My knees went weak, but I steadied myself on the back of a chair and reminded myself to breathe. I took a seat near the back and watched Tessa glide in moments later. Hair done, lipstick perfect, Derek at her side with that same smug half-smile. They moved like a couple used to being admired. When they spoke at a table with potential buyers, they pointed out things I'd repaired: the new gutters, the patched stair, and talked about cosmetic upgrades, as if I'd only ever done superficial work. When a woman near me murmured about the listing price, Tessa's laugh carried across the room like a bell. Bright, untroubled. I felt a thin, hot line of fury thread through my chest but kept my face still. I had come prepared to listen, but what I hadn't expected was how brazen they would be. Derek introduced the lot as a rare investment opportunity and casually referenced how paperwork had been handled to clear the title quickly. He used phrases like market advantage and flexible closings, and the room nodded at his polished sway. I slid my phone out beneath my skirt and hit record. My hands barely trembled. There was a grim steadying to them that felt almost clinical. I focused on capturing voices, names, dates, casual admissions, anything that would pin them down later. Between one round of hors d'oeuvres and the next, I made myself small and approached a man who'd been introduced as an associate of Derek's. He had the kind of face that forgot to be careful when he was pleased with himself. I told him I was new to investing and asked naive questions about how quickly properties moved through their network. He leaned in, preening, and started to boast about the speed of their closings, the creative ways they smoothed over documentation, and the notary who liked to help us meet tight deadlines. Each offhanded sentence was a gift. I leaned forward and listened like a woman compiling a legal indictment. I walked away with his recorded voice and a business card bearing a name I'd only seen in a half-faded PDF. At one point I watched Tessa cross the room and pass within a few feet of me. For a heartbeat I debated standing, walking up to her, taking off whatever fragile mask she still used when she looked at me, and ripping it away. But I didn't. Instead I sipped a water, smiled politely at someone who nodded at me, and stayed. There was power in being quiet. They were loud and bright, and believed their own press. I was the quiet storm collecting proof. Later, sitting in my car, I listened to the audio and felt my chest tighten in a new way, not the raw wound of loss, but the cold satisfaction that comes from knowing the truth is finally on tape. When the auction closed, a nameless investor I'd never met raised a paddle and the gavel came down on my home. The bidding had been brisk and deliberate. The new owner clapped casually as if he'd simply purchased another commodity. I left the ballroom while the congratulations started, pulling my coat up around my shoulders and moving through the cool night air with my recorder chiming in my pocket like a heartbeat. I called Lydia and Cole as soon as I got in the car and sent them the raw files. Cole's response was a single terse line. "Good, that's admissible. Keep watching." I realized then that the event hadn't just been about selling a house, it had been about showing off how untouchable they thought they were. On the drive back, I rehearsed everything I'd heard, filing each line into a mental ledger. I pictured the gavel again and felt something shift inside me, fear turning into a tool, fury into focus. The recordings were not just noise, they were the backbone of something that could be unraveling for them. I thought about the buyers who would be furious to learn they'd bought a stolen title, and about the cozy network Derek had, trusted would hold him up forever. I also thought about Tessa and how she'd laughed, while people admired the very rooms where my grandmother had once hummed old hymns. But the real show hadn't even started. Every door I knocked on was locked until I picked one open myself. The next morning, after the auction, I sat in my car in the motel parking lot and replayed the recordings over and over. The audio was clear, Derek's voice smooth and confident. Tessa's laugh sharp in the background. The words "quick transfer" and "no need to wait on paperwork" echoing like a confession. I thought it would feel like victory, but it didn't. It felt heavy, like holding a truth too sharp to touch. When I took the recordings to my lawyer, he listened carefully, then leaned back with a sigh. "It's good, Evelyn," he said. "But recordings like this are tricky. Without certified verification, they'll argue manipulation. You need corroboration witnesses. Paper. An investigator. An investigator." That was a word I couldn't afford, or so I thought. Lydia had been helping me for free so far, but this was beyond her scope. She did, however, send me a contact, a private investigator named Cole. He had a reputation for taking on financial crime cases the police didn't want to touch. I called him that same day. His voice was rough, patient, the kind of voice that carried equal parts skepticism and curiosity. He agreed to meet at a diner outside town. Cole wasn't what I expected. No trench coat, no theatrics. Just jeans, a worn jacket, and tired eyes that had probably seen too many lies. I told him everything: the scam, the fake refinance, the forged deed, the auction. I slid the USB across the table and waited. He listened quietly as the audio played through his laptop, barely blinking. When it ended, he said, "You're not crazy. You're one of about 50 victims of this kind of thing, only yours is cleaner, more deliberate." I've heard Derek's name before. That was the first time I felt like someone believed me. Cole agreed to take the case on a payment plan. "You'll owe me later," he said, "but let's get you your house back first." He began digging immediately. Within a week, he found shell companies registered under different names but sharing one P.O. box, the same one Derek used for Silverline Investments. Some were connected to other fraudulent property transfers. The pattern was there, we just needed proof of intent. Cole taught me how to read public records like a detective. Every file, every timestamp, every notary signature, it was all data. Together, we traced a string of properties sold to Derek's partners, then resold within weeks for inflated prices. They'd been laundering profits through fake mortgage loans and renovation credits. My house was just one in a chain. He also discovered something else: the notary who'd witnessed my signature was the same one listed on several other forged transfers. But she died 3 months before my supposed signing date. I remember staring at the report, the words swimming in front of my eyes. That single fact could unravel the entire deal. It wasn't just fraud anymore, it was criminal forgery. We compiled everything into a folder thicker than a novel. Lydia helped us formalize the evidence into a chronological timeline, with receipts, documents, voice transcripts, and cross-referenced legal identifiers. It looked like something the district attorney would have to take seriously if we could get it in front of them. But nothing is ever that simple. My first submission to the county fraud division got buried in bureaucracy. No callback, no acknowledgement. When I called for an update, a disinterested clerk told me cases like mine were low priority unless there's a public risk. I wanted to scream. Derek was the risk. He'd built an empire on other people's homes. Cole leaned across his desk, calm as ever. "You want them to listen?" he said. "Make them think it's bigger than one angry homeowner. Build noise. Patterns force action." So I started collecting victims. Using my alias, I contacted the others we'd traced through the same notary and title chain. Some hung up immediately. Others, cautiously hopeful, agreed to talk. I gathered their stories like puzzle pieces: a widow who'd lost her duplex, a veteran scammed out of his land, a single mother evicted with nowhere to go. They all had the same names on their documents: Derek, his network, and that same friendly notary. Lydia helped me draft an anonymous tip to the state fraud division, complete with evidence and timelines. I didn't use my real name. I wanted them to investigate on merit, not pity. Within 2 weeks, Cole got a discreet message from an investigator in Raleigh confirming that preliminary inquiry had begun. For the first time in months, I allowed myself a real breath. But while I waited, Derek and Tessa thrived, or thought they did. She was still posting online about new ventures, photos of champagne glasses and captions like, "When you work hard, good things come your way." I watched, silent and invisible, as her arrogance grew. Derek started networking with higher-end clients, flaunting his investment group in news features about small-town real estate success. It infuriated me, but Cole reminded me to stay patient. "Let them hang themselves with their own rope," he said. "The more confident they are, the less careful they'll be." So I pretended to vanish. No public posts, no confrontations. Just quiet observation. I rented a small apartment under my alias and kept monitoring. Every few days, Cole sent me updates. Investigators were slowly linking transactions, cross-referencing names, and freezing minor accounts tied to Derek's shell corporations. It was working, just agonizingly slow. One night, unable to sleep, I sat by the window and looked out at the city lights. I thought about my grandmother's garden, about the roses that had wilted without care, and about Tessa watering them with hands that had signed away my life. I promised myself that before this ended, she'd watch everything she'd stolen crumble in her hands. Weeks passed. The silence from their end told me the investigation had reached them. Derek's company website went offline for maintenance. Calls to his office went unanswered. Something was shifting. I could feel it. But I didn't rush it, not yet. I wanted the collapse to be complete. And in those weeks, I made sure their confidence grew. To destroy her, I had to let her think she'd won. I dialed Tessa's number with my heart in my throat, and my voice practiced into a softness that felt foreign. The plan was simple and bitter. Make her believe I'd accepted defeat, that I was broken and small and ready to move on. If she thought she'd won, she would drop her guard. Arrogance had been her constant companion. I told myself coldly that empathy now would be a weapon later. I rehearsed the lines that would sound real hesitation, regret, a tired laugh at my own mistakes, so when she heard them, they'd feel authentic. She picked up on the third ring. For a second, the voice on the other end transported me back years. Late-night gossip sessions, shared plates at diners, the comfort of someone who knew your secrets. I swallowed it down and let the practiced vulnerability come through. Tess, I said. I don't want to make a scene. I just want to understand. Can we meet? Coffee. I need closure. She paused, and in that pause, I thought I could hear the gears of her mind turning, calculating, deciding whether I was worth the energy. Fine, she said at last, and gave me a time and place. I wrote it down like a countdown to something lethal. The cafe smelled of burnt espresso and old sugar packets. She was already there when I walked in, looking composed in a scarf that matched the autumn light. She hugged me without hesitation. The motion was automatic. Practiced. I let her hold me for a moment, then sat and let the grief wear the expression I'd rehearsed. She smiled like a woman who'd won something important, and I nearly laughed at the performance of it. We ordered coffee. I asked about her life in thin, placid sentences, letting her talk about little triumphs, new clients, a trip to the coast, a promotion that had nothing to do with her criminal enterprise. She spoke easily, as if guilt were a foreign language she'd never learned. After a while, she leaned back and said the thing I'd been waiting for, an unguarded line she thought would hurt me. You know, when you signed that paperwork, you really made things easier for me, she said, casual as breathing. My fingers tightened around my cup until the porcelain bit into my palm. I smiled and let my eyes shine with manufactured sadness. I thought we were friends, I said softly. I thought you'd help me. She shrugged as if the emotional cost of my trust were a trivial accounting error. People make choices, she said. I made mine. I recorded the whole conversation. Not because I wanted the evidence alone, but because there was power in letting her tell the story in her own voice while believing she was speaking privately. She began to brag small details about how they'd moved titles, references to favors from a notary friend, the way Derek liked to handle sticky closings. She explained in clipped rationalizations that it was necessary and that I had been a liability. I listened without interruption, letting her arrogance flow freely like a confession. Each sentence she dropped was a nail in the coffin I was building, and I stifled the urge to jump up and expose her on the spot. The recording would serve as a damning complement to the other pieces Cole and Lydia were assembling. When she asked if I'd tried to stop the sale, I let the fragile tone of defeat come through. I tried everything, I said. But I don't have the money for lawyers, Tess. I'm tired. She patted my hand as if comforting a child and said, Then rest. You can pick up the pieces later. I've done the hard part. The intimacy of the gesture, so like the one she'd given years before when I'd cried over a broken engagement, felt obscene. I let the memory hang between us and recorded the way she said she'd made sacrifices for both of us. She excused herself with small, self-protective lies about needing to be practical. I let her, because each lie made her easier to trap. When the meeting ended, she hugged me again, this time with a careless energy that betrayed her relief. She believed I was harmless now, a woman who'd been broken by life and chosen to accept it. She watched me drive away, likely filing the encounter under closure achieved. I double-parked around the block, pulled my phone into the car, and played back the recording. Her voice was clear and unvarnished amidst of convenience, references to names Cole had already traced, the kind of details that only someone deeply involved would know. I forwarded the file to Cole and Lydia with 3 words. She said it. The reaction came quicker than I expected. Lydia replied with a flurry of legalese and instructions. Cole's message was a single, concise directive. Hold. Don't contact her again. This is enough. I felt a delicious cold thrill at the confirmation. I'd baited her into declaring her role. I'd made her comfortable enough to confess. I'd taken a friend's embrace and turned it into a noose. Over the next days, Tessa's behavior shifted subtly. She began posting more about new beginnings and moving forward, small public signals of her relief. She texted mutual friends, flimsy excuses about miscommunication and bad business choices. She wanted the world to see a woman who'd moved past conflict. I wanted the world to see a woman who'd orchestrated it. I stayed distant and watched her perform victory, content with the knowledge that the truth existed in voices and files and the memory of a coffee cup in my hand. I often thought about the line between who I'd been and who I'd become. There was a cruelty in playing the beaten friend, but there was a greater cruelty in letting injustice go unpunished. The role required small betrayals of my own moral discomfort, but each felt justified by the scale of what they had taken. I had used tenderness as camouflage. Now their misdeeds would be exposed by their own voices. I slept poorly, but with the satisfaction of a plan working exactly as intended. Now I had her words and her downfall in my hands. The first sign was the silence. It began subtly, a shift in tone, a gap in communication. The absence of noise from the people who used to flood every corner of the real estate scene with their arrogance. Derek's company website, once updated almost daily with flashy photos of successful closings, went offline one morning. At first, it said, under maintenance. A week later, the message changed to, this domain is unavailable. I took a screenshot, dated it, and sent it to Cole. He replied with one word. Good. In the following days, whispers began to spread across the small-town investor circuit. Realtors mentioned paperwork issues. Contractors stopped receiving payments. People who'd been in Derek's orbit started distancing themselves quietly. I watched all of it unfold like a spectator at a play I'd written in secret. They didn't know I'd been feeding anonymous documentation to the very people who'd eventually question them: clients, associates, even a local journalist who'd been investigating property fraud in the region. Every file I sent had been verified and traceable back to Derek's network, never to me. Tessa was the first to crack. Her once boastful social media posts shifted from victory to subtle defensiveness. Gone were the travel photos, the champagne glasses, the bragging captions about taking control of your destiny. In their place came cryptic lines. Not everyone tells the truth. Some people twist stories for revenge. Only time shows who's real. She was scared not of me, but of the invisible storm tightening around her. Cole's updates grew more frequent. The fraud division had quietly started interviewing victims, and Derek's name kept resurfacing. The recordings from the auction and the cafe meeting had been verified by forensic audio specialists, legally sound, admissible. Cole was calm as always, but I could hear the anticipation in his voice when he said, "They're finally connecting the dots. You've got them, Evelyn." For the first time in months, I smiled. Not a polite smile, a real one. Still, revenge isn't instant. Justice grinds slowly, and in the waiting, doubt creeps in. Some nights, I lay awake replaying old memories of Tessa. I remembered her standing beside me in the kitchen, laughing as we cooked pasta, telling me I deserved more from life. I wondered if any part of her friendship had ever been real. Then I'd remember her voice at the cafe, saying, "I made choices." That always settled it. Meanwhile, the investigation deepened. Cole uncovered that Derek had been funneling money into multiple offshore accounts. He'd falsified renovation invoices to inflate resale values. Each fraud case was connected by the same handful of names, the same fake notary, the same web of signatures. Lydia helped package the findings into a report so airtight it could choke a defense attorney. When the fraud division subpoenaed bank records, I knew the endgame had begun. But Derek wasn't the type to surrender quietly. He tried to get ahead of the story. A small local publication ran a flattering article about him, young investor revitalizing communities. The piece read like a PR stunt, with quotes about helping struggling homeowners and building trust in small-town America. I laughed when I saw the photo Derek shaking hands in front of a house he didn't own. Within 48 hours, the article was flooded with comments from angry readers accusing him of scams. My anonymous tip to the editor had included just enough evidence to raise eyebrows without revealing my involvement. Then came the threats. At first, they were subtle anonymous emails warning me to let it go. Text messages from blocked numbers saying things like, "You don't know who you're messing with." I reported them to Cole. He traced the IPs, one from an internet cafe in town, another from a public library. He suspected Derek's people, trying to intimidate victims. I wasn't the only one receiving them, but it confirmed one thing. They were scared. People only threaten what they fear. I didn't reply. Silence is the most unnerving response to a threat, and mine spoke volumes. The more desperate Derek's circle became, the more mistakes they made. One associate tried to sell another fraudulent property, only this time, the buyer was an undercover investigator. Cole sent me the link to the sting operations report with a single note, crack number 1. By the end of that month, 2 former employees of Derek's firm had agreed to cooperate with investigators in exchange for leniency. Their statements matched the evidence Cole and I had gathered word for word. They confirmed that Tessa handled forged documentation and client communication, essentially serving as Derek's fixer. I still hadn't gone public. I wanted them to fall without ever realizing who had pushed. It was better this way, cleaner, quieter, final. But the universe loves a spectacle. A local reporter, the same one who'd hinted about property fraud weeks ago, reached out to the victims group I'd helped connect. They wanted to run an exposé. I didn't have to speak directly. I just had to ensure the right files made it into their hands. I passed the evidence through Lydia, who verified it and handed it off under confidentiality. The article dropped on a Sunday morning. Its title was stark and simple: "The Real Estate Empire Built on Stolen Homes." Within hours, it was everywhere. Derek's photo, once the symbol of self-made success, became the face of greed. Victims' stories poured out in interviews. The same names appeared again and again: Derek, Silverline Investments, and Tessa. My recordings were embedded in the story as anonymous sources, their voices distorted but unmistakable. Social media exploded. Calls for investigation flooded local law enforcement. Commenters dissected every piece of the exposé, and what Derek and Tessa had built, their illusion of power, began collapsing in real time. I watched it all from my small apartment, the glow of my laptop painting the room in pale light. My coffee went cold on the counter, forgotten. After months of helplessness, I was witnessing justice breathe slow, deliberate, unstoppable. And soon, the story reached exactly who I wanted it to. My truth finally had a voice, and it was louder than their lies. The morning the exposé aired, I woke up before sunrise, heart thudding against my ribs. The air in my apartment felt charged, thick with anticipation. The local news anchor's voice drifted from my small television, and then I saw it, the title flashing across the screen: "Small Town Real Estate Empire Under Investigation for Fraud." My hands trembled as I turned the volume up. The segment began with a drone shot of familiar neighborhoods, the kind Derek and Tessa had targeted: homes with cracked fences, chipped paint, but full of life. Then came the victims. Faces blurred, voices disguised, but their pain was unmistakable. They told stories that mirrored mine: forged signatures, fake refinancing promises, and the slow horror of realizing their homes had been stolen. Each word cut through me, because I knew exactly how that disbelief felt: the numb confusion, the fury, the shame. And then I heard it, my own voice. Not directly, but my recording. The one from the auction. They'd edited it into the segment, distorted slightly, but unmistakably Derek's tone smooth, smug, and damning. "Quick transfers," he said on the clip. "No need for full disclosure if you know the right people." The anchor paused, and I could hear the disgust in her voice as she explained how the company had used legal loopholes and falsified paperwork to steal over a dozen homes. They didn't use my name. I was listed only as Source A, but I didn't need credit, I wanted impact. By noon, the story was everywhere. Local channels replayed the footage on loop, online articles popped up with headlines like "Fraud Ring Exposed." investors accused of stealing homes, and community shocked by real estate scam. The comment sections filled with outrage. People demanded accountability. The city's official Facebook page was flooded with questions about when arrests would be made. Cole called me within an hour. "It's out," he said simply. I could hear traffic in the background, but his voice carried a rare edge of satisfaction. "They'll panic now. That's when people make mistakes." He was right. By that evening, Derek's company had gone dark, phones disconnected, social media accounts deleted, and emails bouncing back. The official Silverline Investments office was locked, blinds drawn. According to a reporter friend of Lydia's, investigators had arrived that morning with search warrants. They'd confiscated computers, files, and financial records. Derek's world was crumbling in real time. Tessa, however, reacted differently. I watched her unravel publicly. On her social media, she posted long, frantic paragraphs about being betrayed by her business partner. She claimed she was just handling paperwork, that she'd had no idea what Derek was doing. But her words were hollow, desperate. The comments beneath her posts were merciless accusations, anger, disbelief. People she'd once bragged to were now calling her a thief. It was surreal, seeing her so exposed. I didn't feel joy, just an eerie calm. She had chosen greed over friendship, lies over loyalty. Now she was choking on her own deceit. That night, I received a text from an unknown number. "We need to talk. Please. I can explain." I didn't need to ask who it was. I deleted it without replying. The following day, the exposé went national. A major network picked it up and aired a longer investigative segment. They'd traced Derek's fraud pattern across multiple states, fake companies, forged deeds, and unregistered transfers. I sat frozen as they showed documents that looked exactly like mine. The anchor read off details that I'd uncovered months ago: the dead notary's signature, the shell corporations, the offshore accounts. It was everything Cole and I had built finally out in the open. The impact was immediate. Within 48 hours, a public statement from the State Attorney General's office confirmed that a task force had been formed to investigate the Silverline fraud network. The same article included a line that made my breath catch. "Dozens of victims have come forward, providing audio, documents, and verified communications that implicate multiple individuals in an organized property theft scheme." I was one of those dozens, the quiet voice behind the evidence. Cole called again later that week, his tone triumphant. "They've frozen Derek's accounts. The AG's office is moving fast." "You did this, Evelyn." I wanted to believe him, but part of me still feared it wasn't over. There was always a chance someone would slip away, that money or influence would save them. But when a follow-up story broke showing Derek being escorted into a police car, flanked by detectives, I finally exhaled. His arrogance was gone. His head was bowed. Still, I didn't celebrate. I sat in silence, hands clasped, tears burning behind my eyes. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about validation, proof that I hadn't imagined the betrayal. Proof that the law could work for someone like me, too. A few days later, Tessa's name appeared in the papers. She hadn't been arrested yet, but she'd been brought in for questioning. The photos showed her looking small and pale, nothing like the confident woman from the auction. Seeing her like that didn't make me happy. It made me sad, not for her, but for the years I'd wasted believing she'd been my friend. I didn't respond to any of the messages that poured in from acquaintances, neighbors, or even old coworkers asking if I was the woman in the story. Let them wonder. My silence was my shield. When night came, I turned off my phone, made tea, and sat by the window. Outside, the world looked the same: cars passing, lights flickering, ordinary peace, but inside, everything had shifted. The truth was out. The people who had taken everything from me were finally being seen for what they were. But I wasn't done watching them fall. My truth finally had a voice, and it was louder than their lies. The morning the exposé aired, I was already awake. I hadn't really slept the night before. Anticipation does that to you. The local news logo glowed on the screen of my small television, and the anchor's serious voice filled my kitchen. The headlines scrolled across the bottom: "Real estate scam targets homeowners in 3 counties." My hands trembled, coffee forgotten on the table. The piece opened with the faces of families standing outside houses that looked heartbreakingly like mine. Blurred, anonymous, but you could still see the fatigue in their eyes. They spoke about refinancing help, about trusted advisors who'd turned out to be predators. When the anchor cut to audio clips, my stomach clenched. Derek's voice came through, polished and confident, bragging about fast closings and off-market deals. Tessa's laugh followed, faint but unmistakable. They'd become sound bites, evidence of greed. The news had my recordings. They didn't name me, just a source familiar with the transactions, but hearing their voices on television made me realize how far I'd come from that motel room where I first spread the papers across a bed. This wasn't rumor anymore. It was record. Within hours, it was everywhere. Every local outlet ran a version of the story. The bigger stations picked it up by afternoon, with graphics, drone shots of seized properties, and interviews with legal experts. The words fraud ring and organized theft appeared over and over. I scrolled through comment sections, watching strangers dissect Derek and Tessa's scheme with a kind of collective outrage. The world finally saw what I'd seen for months. Cole called. "It's out," he said. His voice clipped but satisfied. "And they're panicking." He was right. By midday, Silverline Investments' website had vanished. The phones at their office rang out of service. Someone had even taken down the sign from the building. Through Lydia, I learned that investigators had arrived early that morning with boxes and warrants. Employees were being questioned. Files were leaving the building in evidence bags. It was happening exactly the way we'd planned. Quietly, thoroughly, devastatingly. Tessa's reaction hit social media within hours. She posted a long message about being misled by a business partner and having no idea what was happening. It read like a desperate attempt to rewrite history. The comments beneath it were brutal. People called her a liar, a thief, a manipulator. Someone even shared screenshots of her bragging about her investment wins just months before. Every lie she'd told was now eating her alive, one comment at a time. Meanwhile, Derek went silent. His public accounts were deleted, his phone disconnected. But the silence wasn't protection, it was fear. Cole told me that he'd been served with subpoenas and that the Financial Crimes Unit was already freezing his assets. The same arrogance that made him careless was now suffocating him. I thought I'd feel triumph, but what I felt was stillness, a heavy, exhausted calm. I sat on my couch and let the television play until the room was full of other people's voices confirming what I'd known all along, that I hadn't been crazy, or gullible, or alone. The story didn't stop at local news. By the end of the week, a national network ran an expanded segment. They'd traced similar scams in neighboring states, linking them to the same shell companies Derek had created. My voice wasn't part of that piece, but my evidence was. I recognized the documents on the screen, the forged notary stamp, the matching signatures, even the auction photo I'd taken in secret. The next day, the state attorney general held a press conference. I sat glued to my laptop as she announced the formation of a special task force to investigate the systematic theft of residential properties through fraudulent transfers. She promised indictments, restitution, and justice for victims. Behind her, reporters shouted questions, cameras flashing. It didn't feel real. Then came the image that would etch itself into my memory forever. Derek, in a dark suit, being escorted into a courthouse by two officers. No arrogance, no smile, just a hollow, stunned look. I paused the video and stared at it for a long time. The man who'd once stolen my home now had nowhere left to hide. Tessa was next. She hadn't been arrested yet, but she'd been brought in for questioning. Photos surfaced of her leaving the station, face pale, eyes downcast, surrounded by microphones. For a moment, I almost didn't recognize her. The confident woman who'd smiled at that auction was gone. What stood there was a shadow of her own deceit. People from my past started reaching out. Old neighbors, co-workers, even distant relatives messaged me links with words like, "unbelievable," or, "wasn't this your guy?" I ignored them all. I didn't want to be part of the gossip. This was never about recognition, it was about recovery. That night, I turned off my phone, lit a candle, and sat by the window. Outside, the street was quiet, ordinary. For months, I'd lived in chaos, plotting and surviving. Now, for the first time, the noise wasn't coming from me, it was around them. Their empire had fallen, and I'd never even had to raise my voice in public. But I wasn't done watching them fall. They finally got caught, but I wasn't celebrating yet. The day Derek was arrested, the town buzzed like a live wire. News crews crowded outside the courthouse, cameras snapping as if they were capturing a celebrity instead of a con artist. I watched it all unfold from the safety of my apartment, the muted TV flickering in the dim light. Derek looked smaller than I remembered, still in his tailored suit, but the swagger was gone. His hair was unkempt, his jaw tight, and his hands were cuffed. The same man who once smirked at me from my porch was now being shoved into the back of a police car. For a long time, I just stared at the screen. There was no joy, no satisfaction, only a strange stillness. It wasn't relief yet. It was disbelief that after all those months of fighting shadows, the monster finally had a face behind bars. Cole called within minutes. "It's official," he said. "Fraud, forgery, conspiracy. They're adding wire fraud too. He's not getting out easy." His tone carried professional composure, but I could hear the faint smile beneath it. "They're going to start bringing in everyone who worked with him. Everyone." That included Tessa. For days, she kept posting cryptic things online, half denials, half excuses. She claimed Derek had used her, that she was cooperating fully. It might have worked on strangers, but not on me. I knew the truth buried in those recordings, in that coffee shop conversation where she'd practically confessed to her role. I'd been patient for long enough. My lawyer, Andrew, had been following the case closely. He called one afternoon and said, "Evelyn, it's time. We can't sit back anymore. You have the recordings, the documents, the proof. You need to come forward officially." For months, I'd stayed hidden behind aliases and anonymous tips. Coming forward meant revealing myself, the woman they'd scammed, the whistleblower who'd helped take them down. I wasn't sure I wanted that kind of spotlight. But then Andrew said something that shifted everything. "You can either remain a footnote in your own story, or you can end it on your terms." That was enough. We arranged a meeting with the investigators at the state attorney's office. Lydia came with me for moral support. Cole joined remotely. I brought everything, the recordings, the documents, the emails, the photos from the auction. As I spoke, I could feel my hands trembling, but my voice stayed firm. When I played the recording of Tessa's laughter and Derek's bragging, the room went silent. The lead investigator, a woman named Harper, looked at me and said, "You realize this ties her directly to the operation?" "I do," I said quietly. "And I think it's time she answers for it." That was the moment the story stopped being theirs. It became mine again. A week later, the news broke. Tessa Collins arrested on multiple counts of fraud and conspiracy. I saw her mugshot online. The woman who'd once been my best friend now looked hollow, deflated, almost frightened. For a long moment, I just stared at her face. There was no hatred left, only an ache. I remembered every birthday, every secret we'd shared. Every time I'd called her sister. She'd burned all of it for greed. I went to her hearing anonymously, sitting at the very back of the courtroom, hidden under a dark coat and sunglasses. She didn't see me, but I saw everything, the way her shoulders hunched, the way she couldn't meet anyone's eyes. Derek was there too. It was poetic in a way. They'd built their scheme together, and now they couldn't even look at each other. The prosecutor outlined the case methodically, every detail threading perfectly with the evidence Cole and I had given them. My recordings were entered as exhibits. The lawyer read parts of the transcript aloud, Tessa's own words, her arrogance caught in permanent ink. I watched her flinch when she heard herself say, "I made choices." Afterward, I stepped outside and leaned against a cold marble pillar. For the first time, I felt a release that wasn't anger. I didn't cry. I didn't smile. I just breathed deep, deliberate, free. Cole called again that evening. "You did it," he said simply. "They're done. The DA's office is confident about full convictions. You'll get your property back, maybe even damages." But I shook my head. even though he couldn't see me. "I don't care about the money," I said. "I just want my name and my home." That night, I reread the original deed, the one with my grandmother's signature. The ink was faded, the paper soft from years of being folded and unfolded. I ran my fingers over it and felt something close to peace. Still, part of me couldn't stop thinking about Tessa. I imagined her sitting in a cold cell, replaying her own words, realizing too late that the game had turned on her. I wondered if she finally understood what she'd taken from me, not just a house, but trust. The very thing that made friendship sacred. I didn't forgive her. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But I no longer hated her either. Hate gives them too much power. And I'd spent enough of my life letting her control my emotions. What I felt now was simple. Closure. The next morning, the headlines confirmed what I already knew in my gut: Derek and Tessa had been denied bail. Their assets were frozen, their company officially dissolved, and their names permanently tied to one word: fraud. I closed my laptop, exhaled slowly, and looked around the small apartment that had been my refuge. It wasn't the house I'd lost, but for the first time, it felt like home because it was mine, untouched by lies. But my revenge wasn't just legal, it was poetic. Justice means nothing if you don't reclaim what was stolen. The first time I walked into the courthouse to begin the process of reclaiming my home, my knees felt unsteady. It wasn't fear, it was the weight of everything that had brought me there. The marble floors gleamed under the fluorescent lights, and the quiet hum of shuffling papers filled the air. People passed me, carrying their own burdens, custody battles, small claims, evictions. Everyone there was fighting for something. For me, it wasn't just a house. It was proof that I could win after being told I couldn't. My lawyer, Andrew, met me outside the clerk's office, a folder in his hand so thick it looked like it could stop a bullet. Inside were months of work. The original deed, affidavits from neighbors, the notarized statements, Cole's investigative reports, and certified audio transcripts. It wasn't just paperwork, it was my life in pages. "Today's the petition filing," Andrew said, smiling faintly. "We're getting your name back where it belongs." The hearing wasn't dramatic. No pounding of gavels. No courtroom theatrics like in movies. Just calm voices and a judge who seemed genuinely tired of seeing how often people like Derek and Tessa slipped through cracks in the system. The state investigator presented the evidence, walking through the fraud step by step: my forged signature, the fake notary, the offshore transfers, the recordings. Every piece aligned like a puzzle clicking into place. When the judge finally spoke, her tone was steady but firm. "The court finds sufficient evidence of fraudulent transfer and rules in favor of the plaintiff. The sale of the property is hereby voided." The words echoed in my ears. The sale is voided. I'd imagined that moment for months, but hearing it out loud made my throat tighten. My home was mine again. I didn't even realize I'd been holding my breath until Andrew squeezed my shoulder and said quietly, "Congratulations, Evelyn. You did it." Afterward, I stood on the courthouse steps, clutching the newly issued title document like it was something alive. It felt heavier than paper, like it carried the weight of every sleepless night, every doubt, every moment I'd nearly given up. Lydia met me there, holding 2 cups of coffee, and when she saw my face, she didn't need to ask. She just smiled. "Welcome home," she said. The first time I drove back to the house, I didn't go inside right away. I parked at the edge of the gravel driveway and just stared at it. The white paint was fading. The porch rail was broken. The yard, once full of blooming roses, was choked with weeds. It looked tired, abandoned, almost shy under my gaze, as if it didn't quite believe I'd come back. When I finally stepped out of the car and walked up the front path, the smell hit me: dust, old wood, and something faintly floral that had somehow survived all this time. The door creaked when I opened it, just like it always had. The sound was oddly comforting, like the house was whispering a hello. I ran my fingers along the hallway wall, tracing the same grooves I'd touched thousands of times before. The sunlight slanted through the windows, catching in the floating dust, and for the first time in a long while, I felt still. The place needed work. The paint was peeling, and some of the boards were warped. But underneath the neglect, it was still mine. My grandmother's presence lingered in the little things, the uneven tiles in the kitchen she'd refused to fix, the faint scent of her old lavender oil that had somehow seeped into the wood. I sat down on the floor and let the memories wash over me. The next weeks were full of restoration, not just of walls and floors, but of spirit. I spent hours in the garden, clearing weeds and uncovering the stubborn roots of my grandmother's roses. They hadn't died, only waited. New buds appeared after the first week of care. Every blossom felt like a victory. Neighbors stopped by, some cautiously, unsure of what to say after everything that had happened. A few hugged me, others just nodded silently, the kind of gesture that meant we heard, "We're glad you're back." One of them, Mrs. Daly from across the street, brought over a pie and said, "Your grandmother would be proud, honey." That made me cry for the first time since the court ruling. One afternoon, I sat on the porch steps, the sun warm on my face, and looked out over the freshly mowed yard. For so long I'd associated this place with loss and betrayal. Now, it was something else entirely, a symbol of endurance. I realized I hadn't just reclaimed a deed, I'd reclaimed myself. Andrew called a few days later to tell me that the court had officially recorded the property back under my name. "It's done," he said. "You're free and clear." I thanked him. But the truth was, I already knew. I'd felt it the moment I stepped through that creaky front door. That night, I stood by the window, watching the porch light flicker to life, the same old bulb that had somehow survived everything. The house glowed softly, like it had been holding its breath, waiting for me to come home. The house wasn't just back, I was too. The letter came from prison. It arrived in a plain white envelope, no return name, just the correctional facility's stamp and my address printed neatly on the front. I knew who it was from before I even opened it. There was something unmistakable about Tessa's handwriting. Sharp, slanted, a little too precise. Like she was always trying to prove control. For a moment, I just stood in my kitchen staring at it. The idea that she'd found a way to reach me after everything made my stomach twist. I should have thrown it away. I told myself I didn't need her words, her excuses, or her attempts to rewrite what had happened. But curiosity, the same thing that had once made me trust her, got the better of me. I slid a knife under the seal and unfolded the paper. It was 3 pages long. She started with, "Evelyn, I know I'm the last person you want to hear from." She wasn't wrong. The letter was full of sentences that sounded rehearsed, probably drafted and redrafted between cell checks. She wrote about how Derek had manipulated her, how she had never meant for things to go that far. She said she'd been desperate and afraid, that she'd thought she was helping me in the beginning. Then came the part that almost made me laugh, a line about how she envied my strength and how, in some twisted way, she'd always admired my ability to rebuild. It was such a strange thing to read from someone who'd torn my life apart. Halfway through the letter, she said she was trying to make peace, and that she hoped I could find it in my heart to forgive. She wrote that she was attending therapy groups inside, learning about accountability, and that she planned to start over when she got out. She signed it, "With remorse, Tessa." I read it twice, not because I needed to, but because part of me wanted to feel something: anger, pity, closure. But all I felt was tired. The words didn't sting anymore. They just sounded hollow. For a long time, I'd waited for her to acknowledge what she'd done, but now that she had, I realized I didn't need her apology. What I'd built after her betrayal was stronger than anything she could offer in a letter. Still, I folded the pages neatly and placed them on the counter. I made tea and sat down, staring at the envelope beside my mug. I thought about everything that letter represented, every choice that led us here. Friendship turned into fraud. Loyalty twisted into greed. I remembered the laughter we'd shared once, the kind that came easy, before money and power poisoned it. That woman was gone, and so was the part of me that would have missed her. A few days later, Lydia came over to drop off paperwork for the Victim Compensation Fund. She saw the letter sitting there and asked, "You going to respond?" I shook my head. "No, she doesn't get that part of me anymore," Lydia smiled softly. "That's good. Sometimes forgiveness isn't about letting them off the hook, it's about not letting them live rent-free in your head." She was right. Instead of burning the letter, which would have been too dramatic, I did something quieter. I framed it. Not out of sentiment, but as a reminder. I hung it in my home office, behind my desk where I'd begun working on something new. A project that would make sure people like me didn't get scammed again. It started small. I used the knowledge I'd gathered during my fight, the legal loopholes, the fraud prevention steps, the warning signs, and built a simple website. Home Guard Initiative, a free resource hub for homeowners. I included downloadable checklists, links to legal aid, and a contact form for anyone who suspected real estate fraud. Within weeks, messages started trickling in, people from all over the state thanking me, asking for advice. Then came a call from a local nonprofit that helped displaced families. They'd read about me in the follow-up coverage of the case and wanted to partner on outreach. Soon, I was giving workshops in community centers, standing in front of rooms full of strangers, teaching them how to protect themselves. The first time I introduced myself, I said, "My name is Evelyn, and I lost my home to fraud, but I got it back." The applause that followed was gentle, but it filled me with something I hadn't felt in years. Purpose. Sometimes I'd glance at that framed letter before heading out for those talks. It wasn't bitterness that made me keep it, it was gratitude. Strange as that sounded. Without Tessa's betrayal, I would have never learned what I was capable of. I wouldn't have met Lydia or Cole. I wouldn't have turned pain into power. One night, after a long meeting with the nonprofit board, I came home exhausted and looked at the letter again. The light from the lamp hit the glass, reflecting my own face over her words. It struck me how symbolic that was, her attempt to rewrite history overshadowed by my presence, my survival, my growth. I never wrote back. But I whispered a truth into the quiet of the room that night, not for her to hear, but for me to finally release. You don't need my forgiveness. I already took back everything you tried to steal. I turned off the light, leaving the letter in the dark, and went upstairs to bed. For the first time since all of it began, I slept without dreams. She wanted my forgiveness, but I chose my freedom. I built something stronger from the ruins. If you had told me 2 years earlier that I'd one day stand on a stage teaching people how to protect their homes, I would have laughed. Back then, I could barely protect myself. But pain has a way of refining you. It sharpens your instincts, carves out the weakness, and leaves behind something unbreakable. Home Guard started as a few downloadable guides and phone calls, but it grew faster than I ever imagined. Within months, word spread through community forums, legal clinics, and local news features. People reached out from neighboring states asking if we could help identify suspicious real estate paperwork or verify property records. Lydia helped me manage the legal side, ensuring our advice stayed compliant and accurate. Cole volunteered part-time, reviewing fraudulent cases and training volunteers on how to gather admissible evidence. What began as my healing process was slowly becoming a movement. The first time I was asked to speak publicly about what happened, I almost said no. The thought of reliving everything, the signatures, the betrayal, the humiliation, felt unbearable. But then I thought about the widow who'd lost her home to the same scam, the single mother who'd called me crying because she recognized Derek's company name. My story wasn't just mine anymore, it was theirs too. So, I said yes. The event was small, held in a community center with flickering lights and folding chairs, but every seat was full. I remember stepping up to the microphone, my palms slick with sweat, and looking at all those faces, people who'd been tricked, people who'd been made to feel stupid for trusting. I took a deep breath and said, "My name is Evelyn, and I lost my home to fraud, but I got it back." The words felt like a declaration, not of victory, but of survival. Afterward, a man approached me with tears in his eyes. He said, "You made me believe I can fight back too." That was the moment I understood. Revenge was fleeting, but empowerment was eternal. I didn't want to destroy people anymore. I wanted to build armor for others. With grant support from a consumer rights foundation, Home Guard expanded. We developed online workshops and partnered with local banks to educate clients on spotting fraudulent refinancing offers. I hired a small staff, most of them survivors like me, each with their own story of loss and reclamation. Together, we created a network of resilience. Every month, I received letters and emails from people thanking me. One came from an older couple in Tennessee who'd nearly signed away their farm to a fake consultant. Another from a young woman who'd been on the verge of foreclosure until she learned how to verify her title through our website. Each story felt like a seed planted in the soil of everything I'd lost. And then, something I hadn't expected happened. The media came calling again. This time, it wasn't about Derek or Tessa. It was about me. A national talk show reached out, wanting to feature my journey as part of a segment on resilience. I hesitated. Exposure had never been my goal, but Lydia convinced me it could help others. "This isn't about fame, Evelyn," she said. "It's about reach." So, I agreed. The studio lights were blinding, the cameras intimidating, but when the host asked me what kept me going, I didn't hesitate. Because I refused to let anyone else feel as powerless as I once did. I said. The audience applauded softly, and for a fleeting second, I thought about my grandmother's house. The way the morning light hit the windows when I was a child. I imagined her watching, proud. After that interview aired, donations poured in. HomeGuard opened offices in 3 more counties, and we started a helpline for at-risk homeowners. I spent my days doing what once felt impossible, helping others find justice before their pain had a chance to harden into vengeance. Sometimes, late at night, I'd look through old files from the case. Not out of obsession, but as a reminder of where it started. I'd see Tessa's name on those documents and feel nothing but distance. Her choices had built my purpose, even if she never intended it. Derek was serving a long sentence for multiple counts of fraud. Their names would forever be tied to crime, while mine had become tied to protection and reform. It wasn't lost on me that this was the truest form of revenge, turning their destruction into my creation. I no longer needed to watch them fall. I had risen beyond their reach. The last time I visited the courthouse, it wasn't for a case or hearing. It was to meet with officials about creating an educational partnership with HomeGuard. Standing in the same halls where I'd once trembled, I realized I no longer felt small. I belonged there. That night, I sat on my porch, the air thick with the scent of blooming roses, and smiled to myself. The house was quiet, but it wasn't lonely anymore. It had become a beacon, a place reborn from pain, now filled with purpose. And I wasn't done yet. The night I finally slept peacefully in my own home again, I realized I'd won. It was a warm summer evening when I walked barefoot across the porch, the same porch that had once been a battlefield of memories. The wood was new, now, smooth, sturdy, freshly stained, but the wind still whistled through the same spaces it always had. The roses in the garden, once dead and brittle, had returned in full bloom. Their scent drifted through the open window, sweet and stubborn, just like the woman I'd become. Inside, the house felt alive again. The walls were painted a soft cream. The floors gleamed with polish. And the air no longer carried the ghosts of betrayal. I'd rebuilt everything, down to the smallest detail, the framed photographs of my grandmother on the mantel. The restored reading chair by the window. The quilt she'd made that still smelled faintly of cedar. Every piece of the home was a testament to survival. That night, I invited a few people who had stood by me through it all. Lydia brought her signature. Lemon bars, Cole arrived with a bottle of wine, and even Andrew, my lawyer, stopped by with flowers. We sat around the dining table, my grandmother's table, the one that had witnessed every meal, every fight, every prayer, and laughed. The laughter didn't sound forced anymore. It was genuine, rich, and full of gratitude. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with pink and gold, Cole raised his glass. "To justice," he said, smiling. Lydia added, "To starting over." And then, after a pause, I lifted my own glass and said, "To never being afraid to fight back." The clinking of glasses was soft, but it felt like thunder in my chest. For the first time, the sound of victory wasn't loud or violent, it was calm, earned, and deeply personal. Later that night, when everyone had gone, I stepped out onto the porch alone. The cicadas hummed in the distance, and the moonlight spread across the yard like a soft veil. I sat in my grandmother's old rocking chair, the one that had survived every storm, and watched the shadows move across the lawn. The silence didn't feel empty anymore. It felt like peace, the kind you build, not the kind you're given. I thought about everything that had led here, the betrayal, the lies, the endless fight. I thought about the woman who'd once sat crying in a motel room, clutching papers she didn't understand. That woman had believed her life was over. She couldn't see the version of herself who now sat under the moonlight, stronger, wiser, unbreakable. For months, people had told me revenge was dangerous, that it would consume me. Maybe they were right, for a while. But what they didn't understand was that revenge isn't always about destruction. Sometimes, it's about restoration. It's about taking back what's yours and refusing to live as someone else's victim. My revenge hadn't been loud or violent, it had been smart, deliberate, patient. I didn't just watch Derek and Tessa fall. I built something lasting from the wreckage they left behind. They had stolen a house, but I'd turned their theft into a foundation for something bigger: truth, awareness, empowerment. I'd proven that even the smallest voice, if persistent enough, can bring down giants. As the night deepened, a light breeze rustled through the rose bushes. I could almost hear my grandmother's voice in that wind, soft and proud. "You did it, Evie," she would have said. "You brought it back to life." I smiled through tears, whispering into the quiet, "We did, Grandma." The following week, I installed a brass plaque beside the front door. It wasn't big, just a small, shining square that read, "This home was reclaimed through truth and persistence." Every person who visited stopped to read it, and I never explained more than, "It's a reminder. Some stories don't need to be told in full to carry their power." As the seasons changed, I began hosting small gatherings for HomeGuard donors and volunteers in my backyard. The laughter that filled that space each time was a sound I'd once thought I'd never hear again. Even the neighbors who'd kept their distance during the scandal came around, offering friendship, asking questions, wanting to help. The house had become more than mine, it had become a symbol of what resilience could look like. Sometimes, on quiet mornings, I'd stand by the kitchen window with my coffee, watching sunlight pour across the garden. That's when I felt it most, the difference between surviving and living. Survival is holding on despite the storm. Living is opening your windows afterward and letting the light in again. Every room told a story. The kitchen of rebuilding, the living room of forgiveness, the garden of rebirth. I no longer saw the ghosts of what I'd lost. I saw the proof of what I'd reclaimed. The woman who'd once been broken by betrayal now stood in her own home, unshakable. That night, I locked the doors, turned off the lights, and climbed into bed. The sheets were cool, the house quiet except for the soft creak of settling wood. I closed my eyes, feeling the stillness settle around me, and realized this was the first time in years I wasn't waiting for the next blow to fall. I was safe. I was home. They stole my house, but I built an empire on their downfall.